We're almost near the finish line, but not before we have this, I think, genuinely important conversation. So, a little context. If anybody hasn't heard, Australia is sort of trending right now in global climate negotiations. Our Minister Chris Bowen is shepherding the major negotiation of this COP, the new collective quantified goal. And we're also in the running, I would say, at the front of the pack in the running to host COP31 in 2 years' time. So when the minister says Australia is punching above its weight, that is increasingly a reality on the global scene. And that is especially true with countries like my home country of relatively recent extraction removing itself from any sort of leadership. Middle powers like Australia have begun to and will need to step up increasingly to fill that vacuum. And there's some good news on that front. So just like I think a month ago, the dial ticked over and Australia officially announced that there are now 4 million homes across the country with solar panels on the roof, which is a huge accomplishment, and I believe the highest per capita solar penetration of any except the smallest countries in the world anywhere. So it's a major accomplishment. And as we think about what is Australia bringing to the table when it hosts COP31, this is like a major thing potentially to brag about. If we play our cards right, we could be the world's leader on household clean energy, really of anybody. And what's so important, especially as a unionist, and also for the few of you I don't know, Dan Sherrill, I'm the climate and energy lead at the Australian Council of Trade Unions. As a unionist, we know that climate solutions also have to be economic solutions. We know that politically, and this is true around the world, people care about the end of the world, people care about climate change, but in order to care about that thing, they first have to be able to feed their family. They first have to be able to have a decent job. They have to be able to not be stressed at the end of the month because they don't know how they're going to make ends meet. And so for us, household clean energy is this critical nexus where you have climate action on the one hand, jobs on the other, and finally, the long-term reduction of energy bills, which is a huge driver of cost of living for a lot of people. So this is incredibly important. I heard a quote on a panel a few days ago from the famous unionist Chico Mendes, who said, environmentalism without class consciousness is merely gardening. And so this is about inserting a class consciousness into climate action by putting power back into people's hands. So what does Australia need to do to be the world leader on this critical issue before we host COP31, so we can legitimately get up on the stage and say, we are leading by example? This is also relevant because, as many of you who follow Australian politics probably know, we have both the government and the LNP teasing that there may be possibly going to do something in this space. And so I am joined by an incredible panel, an incredibly diverse panel, stakeholders from all sectors, to talk about what are we looking for here for Australia to step up and do, and why it's important. So I'll just go down the line. We have Reverend Mata, who the ACTU has had the privilege of working with increasingly over the last few months, and a genuine privilege. She is the moderator of the Uniting Synod of Church of New South Wales, and really a climate and faith leader out in Western Sydney. We have Danai Busler, who is the Assistant Secretary appointed, hopefully soon elected, of the Victorian Trades Hall Council, another climate champion in the union movement. We have Simon Holmes-A-Court, a multi-hatted man, here as a senior advisor with the Smart Energy Council, but also instrumental in the Climate 200 movement, which has been so important in reshaping climate politics in Australia. And finally, we have Kelly Cott, who is the climate and energy lead, my counterpart at the Australian Council of Social Services, the peak body for social services in Australia. So give them a round of applause. So I'm going to start in reverse order with Kelly, actually. So Kelly, ACOS, the ACTU, Uniting Church, organizations around the country have come together in a coalition recently to sketch out a vision for Australia assuming that leadership on household clean energy. I wondered if you could talk us through sort of what have we developed and what's the thinking behind it.
explain to everyone how these worked, and I can't get mine. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to come down and join the people, but also so I can see the slides. And actually, before I start, I just want to acknowledge all the First Nations people that are here at this COP, and the First Nations Australian people sitting with us here today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded in Australia. Yes, Renew Australia for All. So as Dan talked about, Australia is leading on a number of fronts in our energy transition. We made the hallmark of 4 million solar panels on homes just this week. But not everyone is benefiting from the transition. And we're starting to run into challenges of social licence in particular, where people aren't directly seeing the benefit, and our ability to accelerate action on climate change is starting to diminish. So as Dan said, there's a group of organisations, multi-sector alliance, unions, faith, social organisations, climate, industry like Smart Energy Council, as well the Clean Energy Council, environment groups have all joined together to develop a historic climate package that will accelerate climate change and benefit everyone in Australia, prioritizing those people and communities that are disadvantaged and marginalised. We've got 4 pillars in this package, the first one being repower homes, transport and communities, which we're going to talk mostly about today. We've also got a pillar around resourcing people and communities to adapt and build resilience to climate change impacts that are already locked in and that we know will accelerate over the coming years. We've got a pillar around building power grid that we need, so large-scale renewable energy and demand, and then securing Australia's manufacturing and industry as well. But what we're focusing here today is a package that we announced about 3 months ago now called the Repower Our Homes. It's an energy bill savings plan. And it's focused on how do we cut energy bills for good, permanently reduce energy bills for households, improve health outcomes at the same time as reducing emissions. We've got 3 pillars in this bill. So what we're calling for is a $5 billion investment by the Australian federal government in what's called MYEFO, so it's our mid-year economic forecast, and that's due sometime in December. Yes, very soon. And then we're asking for that to be scaled up and accelerated over the next 10 years. So we're estimating we're going to need an investment of about $50 billion to repower roughly 10 million homes in Australia. And then the third important pillar is that we share the benefits fairly, so that the benefits are targeted at those that need it the most, and that we also have strong protections for households and, importantly, workers as well. So the last thing I'm just going to talk a little bit about is what are the benefits. So we've estimated that households can be saving anywhere between $2,000 and $3,300 a year, and that's through energy efficiency, so thermal upgrades, electrification of appliances, so shifting people off gas into more efficient electric appliances, and then adding things like rooftop solar and battery to households. This will generate something like, and this is conservative, 45,000 gigawatts of energy. And that's the additional benefit of that is the avoided that we need to invest in large scale and in transmission. It also builds resilience in the home when you've got that decentralised energy. 18,000 new jobs, and Dana's going to talk a little bit about that later. And then 40,000 megatons of pollution saved. So this is a really important package to be achieving multiple benefits for government and people, and build that social licence and support for accelerating action on climate change.
Beauty. Thanks so much, Kelly. Another round of applause. So, for these beautiful slides. So that's the broad overview. And when we talk about repowering a home, again, it sounds kind of abstract. It's really just a series of technological switches in that home. So you're putting a solar panel on the roof, putting a battery in the garage or out back, so that you're firming that solar panel, storing its energy, and then you're swapping out gas appliances for electric appliances, and then wrapping that all in a more insulated thermal shell so that you're not losing as much energy. So your house as a whole produces its own energy, that energy is renewable, and it also uses less energy overall. That's what we talk about materially when we talk about repowering a home. And as Kelly said, there are 4 million homes in Australia that have already begun on this journey. They tend towards the upper end of the income spectrum, not all the way up, but like upper middle. And so how do we extend those benefits across the millions of other households in Australia? The other point here is that we're talking about a lot of jobs. And so I wondered from Danai, this is kind of like, it's not an intuitive thing for the union movement to be leading a panel on. So why is this union business?
Well, we know that climate change is union business, so we're always been present in these conversations. The ACTU and the union movement's been having these conversations for the better part of 50 years. And I was reading an old document from like 1981. Back in 1981, the Australian Union Congress was saying renewable energy is the future. This is where we need to be investing. But why do I'm focusing in on the 18,000 jobs number that was up there. Why does that matter? Why do good jobs matter in this? And of course, if we're going to be asking the government about a $5 billion investment, huge investment in energy efficiency upgrades, we want that investment to be a good return on investment, so we want to get good jobs out of it. But I also think a lot in this context about, and already I'm deep quoting feminist Emma Goldman in this here, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. If there's not a good life out of this, it's not my just transition. Like, we want to have good jobs out of this just transition. And so there's kind of 4 pillars of this campaign that the union movement's really focusing on in how we want to see this huge energy efficiency package delivered and what the opportunity is for us. And the first one's around training and apprenticeships. We know how important training and apprenticeships is through this, fully funding TAFE programs. I'm from the state of Victoria, so I'm going to be shamelessly plugging Victorian examples for the next 5 minutes because I want to just put in hedge my bets there about how great Victoria is and the examples that we can lead from in Victoria. But we've been running incredible apprenticeship programs, particularly in what we call WIMDOI in the union movement, which is women in male-dominated occupations and industries. And Trades Hall, we run programs about getting more women into these apprenticeships as well too. So we need fully funded TAFE places across the sector. We need targets and ratios for bringing diversity through the apprenticeship program. And that's not just more women, that's young people. We've supported people out of prison into these programs as well too, and particular First Nations comrades. And that needs to be, sorry, I'm from the union movement, so you're going to hear me drop comrade as well. So just sit tight on that part as well. And these programs are practical that we run on the ground. We are buying tools for people who it's their first job that they've been able to have access to that's with a real wage as well too. And we're buying them tools and running mentorship programs and getting them ready for that. So that's the first one there as well too. The second one is around local procurement incentives. And I know local procurement's probably like the least sexiest thing, although there's a lot of things at COP that are not sexy, I will say. It's my first COP. But procurement's pretty unsexy a topic, but an absolute passion and love of mine. For the last 10 years, I've been working at Trades Hall in the union movement. The targets that we need to set in the clean energy economy around procurement and around local manufacturing is what is going to make this worth it for Australian manufacturing. We know Australian manufacturing has the capacity to deliver this. Yes, there'll need to be investment and there'll need to be support from the federal government to upskill and also to make sure we've got the equipment to deliver on this. But local procurement doesn't just mean the big turbines and the big solar panels. It also means a whole bunch of componentry and the processes that we go through, not just for installation, but for maintenance as well. There's a whole piece of the puzzle there, and we know from industry that we need to have a pipeline of projects going because that's what business needs, that's what industry needs to invest to make sure that they can deliver on the local procurement. There's also elements there. I've just lost mine. No, there it is, of accreditation and licensing. And here's a fun fact that I'm sure everyone in the room will know. And I can't claim it. It comes from the ECU National Secretary. Australia has some of the lowest rates of electrical fires and household fires in the world. We kind of take that for granted, but we actually really shouldn't. And you have a unionised, accredited Sparky to thank for that. We have some really high quality accreditation and standards in this country. And you know what it means? It means safety. Like, there's very practical reasons for why we have high accreditation and high standards. So as part of this, we need to make sure that we've got good, am I talking for too long already?
No.
We've got good national accreditation standards as well, to make sure that there's been some cowboys in this industry, and we need to make sure that there's no cowboys in the industry, and this is how we deliver on it. And last one is just really quickly about labour standards and labour protections, which everyone will know I can talk about till the cows come home, but I'll leave it there. Things like portable long service leave entitlements so that workers can be in the clean energy industry and be working between different sites, different employers across the sector, and be still able to transfer and take their entitlements with them will be a really key part of making sure we keep the skilled workforce that we need. Sorry, Dan.
Do not apologize. Oh yeah, there's another round of applause. I never think Danai talks too long. I always think she doesn't talk enough. And yeah, I think just to drill down on that point, like, Lachlan Murdoch is waiting for solar panel wiring to cause a house fire that he can put on Sky News and try to rewind all of this progress. Like, it's going to be Pink Bats 2.0, and that is people are salivating for that culture war problem to happen. The way you prevent that and preempt that is through a well-trained unionized workforce. We've already seen that in Australia with all the wiring we've done in houses for decades, and it needs to remain the case and get stronger as we move to a fully repowered housing stock. So I wanted to turn next to Simon and zoom out a little bit from the household to the energy system as a whole. So when we talk about rewiring homes, it's actually what's not being proposed there, but what's being implemented there is a pretty radical restructuring of the energy system from an old system of baseload power, where you had one giant plant cranking out energy, to a million of tiny distributed plants all over the country that take the form of solar panels and batteries on an individual property. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the different political economies of a baseload energy system versus what's often referred to as consumer energy resources, but a more distributed energy system. Like, what impact does this have? And I guess more pointedly, what does this mean for the whole debate around nuclear on the one hand and household clean energy on the other?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks, everyone, for coming along today. It's quite a bit to unpack there. In Australia, the national debate around energy often seems like it's framed that we're at some crossroads right now and we've got to make a decision. Are we going to go the renewable path, or are we going to go some other path? And at the moment, there's this crazy debate, are we going to go nuclear or renewables? This transition isn't starting now. This transition started a long time ago. Actually, you could argue it goes back to, I'll give credit to John Howard, who announced the mandatory renewable energy target in 1997, which started in 2001 and enjoyed bipartisan support right the way up to about 2012, I would say. I remember being in Parliament the day when the extension of the renewable energy target, when it was lifted from 10% to 20%, this was back in 2009, and the leader of the opposition energy minister, which was Greg Hunt at the time, was berating Labor. What took you so long to increase the renewable energy target? There was real bipartisanship on renewable energy then, and it's been through some periods of attack, but it's been a great advantage for especially rooftop solar, that there has been bipartisanship mostly on rooftop solar. It's been a bit messy in the large scale, but we've had pretty stable policy settings since about 2001. One of the great benefits of that is how efficient Australia's rooftop solar industry is. If you want to install rooftop solar in the US, you'll pay 3 times as much per watt as we pay in Australia. I saw a comparison recently. If you imagine the cost of putting a solar panel on your roof is going to be the panels, the wires, an inverter, the labour, the company's profit, the company's advertising to acquire customers. That customer acquisition cost, in the US, their customer acquisition cost is greater than the entire stack of costs in Australia to put solar on your roof. We are really good at it because we've just been repeating the process again and again and again, 300,000, 400,000 a year for, since forever. And it's become really significant, as we've heard today. It's up to about 11% of Australia's electricity is coming from rooftop solar. It's 16 gigawatts from households, about 9 gigawatts from commercial industrial users. And unlike many other countries, the majority of our solar in Australia is on rooftops. A lot of other countries, it's the inverse, but for us, it's 2/3 to 3/4 of our solar is on rooftops. But how does that fit into the wider system? Well, I think this is a really interesting point in time, 2024. 12 years ago, so a dozen years ago, we were at 10% renewables in Australia. We're right on around about pretty close to, 39% at the moment, right? From 10 to 39 in 12 years. By the energy market operators' projections, in 12 years' time from now, we'll be above 90%. So we go from 10 to 90 in just 24 years. It's a very, very rapid transition. And households are a very significant part of that transition in the projections. It's looking, they expect that about half the storage in Australia will come from consumer resources. Much of that will be from batteries in houses, but quite a bit will probably come from flexible demand, or vehicle to grid will play a role in that under their projections. And then the demand response that comes from smart appliances, from people having their hot water heaters moving to when energy is plentiful, their pool pumps to when energy is plentiful, rather than just running it willy-nilly like at the moment. So the energy transition is not starting now. It's well underway, and there's strong political support. Strong policy support for it from the government. They came in with a target of 82% renewable by 2030. It's a big percentage, a big number. That number had come out of modelling, so there's high confidence that it's technically achievable. But for the first 18 months or so of the government, we're all sitting wondering what's going to pull this through, what's going to actually build these projects. So it was a great relief that the current government brought in a system called the Capacity Investment Scheme, which helps to underwrite so that companies can build the financial case to push these projects forward. And we're seeing a big uptick in projects reaching financial close. Just on that topic, I mentioned nuclear. There is a crazy debate in Australia right now. A lot of people in the audience know where the coalition has come out and tried to paint an alternative future. They're painting a model, painting a picture that somehow it's reckless to go renewables, and it would be much smarter if we just pause everything right now and start building nuclear, and sometime in the mid-2040s the first plants might come online. There's all sorts of I think political economy problems with that. It requires bipartisanship really at state and federal level to be present and durable for the next 30 years or so. But one of the biggest problems, and I think this is really cutting through in campaigns, is how unsuited it is for our grid. We have these very large proportions of solar during the day. In South Australia, it's not uncommon that very high percentages, even as high as 100% or higher of their energy demand is being satisfied by rooftop solar. They'll hit 100% rooftop solar and be exporting the surplus over to the eastern states. That is very difficult to make. Was very difficult to make nuclear work in a grid like that. Nuclear can ramp a little bit. It can ramp quite a bit, but it takes a very when a plant switches off, it takes many hours, if not days, to switch it back on again, and does damage to the plant. So this was an issue that they had in Ontario in Canada when they introduced large-scale renewables there. After a while, they brought in a regulation that gave nuclear priority over renewables. So whenever the demand is low and there's a fight over which technology is going to generate, nuclear takes the priority, and it's the renewables that are switched off there. So the political challenges of having nearly 4 million households with solar on the roof being told, sorry, we're going to have to switch your solar panels off during the middle of the day because the nuclear power stations we're building need to run in order to meet their technical and economic requirements. I don't think that's going to fly, and already the public is starting to show that they're receptive to that message.
I'm going to ask you just one quick follow-up, Simon. When we talk about repowering a home, what you're really doing is making that home into a mini power plant that feeds into the grid in a distributed way. I'm wondering, what do you think that does to a sense of civic participation in this country, or what does it mean for people to re-engage with the energy system in that way, and a system that henceforth, or up until now, has been, I think, quite abstract for people?
Yeah, you remind me, Dan, one thing that's been fascinating to watch in Australia is every time there is a confected political crisis of we're going to have blackouts, or we're going to, or energy prices are going through the roof, anytime it becomes a front page story trying to throw shade on renewables, we see massive upticks in people installing solar and now installing batteries. Afraid that we are going to have blackouts, and they go out and buy batteries. And we have I think it's 180,000 Australian homes have a battery right now. Australian homeowners have invested $25 billion over the last 5 years installing batteries in their home that are helping to soften the peak in the evening to make our grid more flexible, more resilient. And people love it. Australians love having solar on their roof. A lot of people come to it in different ways. Some from environmentalism. I think a very large percentage of Australians are coming into it just from affordability of energy. But people with solar, I think everyone can attest on this panel that when people get a new solar or battery, they're proud as punch that it's in their home. Now we're seeing this Rewiring Australia movement. Saul Griffith is one of the leaders in it, and he's empowering communities across Australia to come together and work out how they can come together, do group buying, push policies at their local government level, at the state level, and advocate for programs like this. One thing I'm finding fascinating is as these groups come together, and I've gone and spoken to to about 5 or 6 of them. I see the same people in those as I'm seeing in the community independence movement, in the movement of people who want a revitalisation of democracy. There's a big overlap between that and people who want to see Australians take more control over their power system. So when we're seeing civic re-engagement around democracy, we're also seeing civic re-engagement about energy, and the overlap between them, I think, is in both cases, it's about empowerment and a degree of self-sufficiency and collectivism.
Yeah, to put more of a pin in it, what we're doing when we repower homes is democratizing the energy system, and I think people feel that in their gut. But you brought up the subject of affordability, and Reverend Mata, I wanted to hear from you. For your congregants and the communities that you're working with out in Western Sydney, I know energy bills play a big role for folks in household budgeting. And so how are your communities coming to this issue of household clean energy? And what would it mean to suddenly have a whole new raft of subsidies that facilitated that for people? And last piece of this multi-piece question, how can we make sure that's equitable? How can we make sure that's actually targeting the people that need it most?
Thank you so much, Dan. I want to firstly greet you all, my brothers and my sisters, in the mighty name of God. I also want to acknowledge our First Nations people, Auntie over here. I am a leader of the Uniting Church for the state of New South Wales ACT. I'm also a daughter of the Pacific, first generation Tongan woman. As I move across, we're one of the biggest service providers in Australia of community services. And so as we move across our services, we hear on the ground the struggling families that are struggling with the cost of living pressures, and that's paying for electricity. And some of them have to make difficult decisions, whether it's to pay their rent or pay their electricity. And that's a reality. And we hear that across our congregations, we hear that across our service providers, particularly for the vulnerable part of our community. We work very closely with the Pacifica diaspora communities, as well as First Nations, young families. But what we're hearing here, and I guess part of my role as a leader of the church, is just like here at COP, we have very powerful people. We have leaders of the world that are here. And if we put that into Australia, we have leaders of the government. My role as a leader of the church is to remind the country of the small people, vulnerable people like myself, who have experienced my electricity being cut off as a single mother once upon a time. And so our role is to continue to advocate and to remind the leaders as we transition into renewable electricity and energy is to not leave, is to take everybody with us. And we talk about solar panel, we talk about batteries. What about the renters? What about the renters? What about people who are relying on public transport to get around? And my role will always be as a leader of the church is to remind the people of those that this is quite real for them. I just want to tell you one story. I know that in one of our congregations in Western Sydney in Auburn, a couple of years ago, one of their mission was to take the leftover bread from the supermarket and make it accessible for the community. That was 2 years ago. And he would bring 3 cartons of these bread and people will come and take it. That's tripled. And it's a sign of saying that the cost of living is a real thing for our everyday people. That's one story. The other is, I'm a preacher, right? There's a wonderful story in the Bible that talks about being a part of the body, being a part of the world, being a part of the country. And it means that when one part of the body is doing so well, we want to get alongside and to celebrate that, to celebrate the great things that the government is doing to move to transitional renewable energy. But when one part of the body is struggling, we have a responsibility as human beings to actually do something about that. So if we can even that out into an equitable way, then we all win. We all take our people with us. And so my role in this, Dan, is to remind leaders, powerful people, of everyday people like myself on the ground, doing it tough sometimes, and needing to be seen and to be heard, but also for action to be taken.
Yeah, thank you for that. Incredibly important. And I think when we talk about who's going to benefit from this, we have to be thinking about what are the housing types we're targeting with policy, you know? It can't just be individual homeowners in the suburbs. That's important. But how are people in strata buildings and multifamily units accessing that? How are renters, incredibly importantly? There's an increasing... If you live in Sydney, you know... If you're a young person in Sydney, you know renting is a thing, and it's getting more of a thing because housing prices are totally inaccessible for the large majority of the population. So how do we make sure that, again, majority of the population doesn't get left behind? And then also social housing, folks living in social housing. And that should really be the first cab off the rank, because that is housing owned by the government, where the government makes the decisions about what are the technologies installed. And also in First Nations communities, and especially remote communities, where a lot of folks are reliant on really expensive and polluting diesel generators, which is just like the energy of 3 decades ago, you know? Whereas I know that, you know, our comrades at the First Nations Clean Energy Network have been experimenting with solar microgrids in remote communities out in WA. How do we start subsidizing that and making sure that those communities own that infrastructure? So these are some of the ways we're trying to think through how do you actually start with the people that need it most, and not have this just be, Teslas for the professional managerial class. So maybe I'll come back to you guys in a second, but I want to stop now. We have about 20 minutes left in the panel, and see if there were any questions from the audience, and I see one in the back, or any questions that the panelists have for each other, because we don't get to talk as often as we'd love to. So let's start with the audience back there.
Hi, my name's Dave Kelly. I'm a Labor MP from WA, a state MP. So you just touched on the issue of social housing and renters. In particular for renters, what are you actually advocating in order to get renters access to this, the new technology? So that's question one. Question two, the issue of individual homes having their own batteries. Not talking out of school, but you talk to Treasury, they love the idea of the residential household paying for their own battery rather than there being a community scale battery that the government pays for and facilitates, because it means the individual household is paying the cost rather than the state. I'm just a little bit sceptical of the economics of individual households having their own battery, because for low-income earners it's very, very difficult, and in a way it is a bit of cost shifting it's more economical to have a larger battery than lots of little ones. So that second question, the economics and the social justice of household batteries, but first question is access for renters. What are you actually asking for?
Yeah, really good. So on renters, Kelly, do you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, I can touch on that, and I'll do a little bit on the other second question as well. So the slide I didn't show you is this very detailed policy slide about how we actually do this. It's my favourite slide because I'm a deep policy person. But Dan said we need to be targeting different households. We've got different policy mechanisms for public housing, for community housing, for owner-occupiers, including low-income owner-occupiers, and then private rental, because they all have quite different solutions. Public housing, government. There's no other solution to that. Community housing providers, we think that there's a mixture of a grant and low-interest finance that comes through Housing Australia, for example. If you're a small provider, community housing provider, you're probably more grants, less low-interest finance. If you're a big community housing provider, you flip that around. So, essentially you put in a business case and then you work it out with Housing Australia. So that's the proposal around community housing providers. Private rentals is the trickiest one, and especially for ACOS, it's a big issue for us, because a lot of people on, for example, job seeker, they're not in social housing, right? So the people on the lowest income are in private rental and cannot afford their rent. So we see so many people now homeless, living in cars, living in tents, that don't even get the choice to access this. So private rentals is the biggest issue. The international and domestic research says we cannot do this without mandating energy performance standards. And where we're at the moment is there's another bit of a policy piece going on at the moment, is we recognise that while landlords do get some benefits through tax, negative gearing, capital gains, etc., we recognise that if we're going to have the stick approach with mandating, we probably also need a bit of a carrot. And so we think there's opportunity to look at financial support and incentives with conditions put on them. So if you're going to get some financial support, then you would cap rent above CPI for a period of time in exchange for those subsidies. And you might subsidise in different ways, so that to meet your base level of energy performance standard, you might get a small subsidy, access to no interest or some low interest finance. If you go above and beyond, like do the whole kit and caboodle, will incentivise you to even go further faster. So they're the sorts of things that we're looking at the moment in that space. On the battery one, there's probably some different views on here, but I think I'm a little bit in your camp. I'd like to see a bit more work on what's the most efficient and equitable way to deliver storage to communities. I think that's missing. There's bits of research done, but they're by interest group, where there's, one interest group will say this is the best way, and another interest group says this is the best way. And I actually think we need to seriously look at that, because equity is a big issue already in our energy system. You just have to look at subsidies at the moment. I don't have an issue with subsidies, but when you recoup costs through electricity bills, like our small-scale renewable energy scheme currently is, it means people without these technologies are contributing more to the cost of that. So, putting a battery scheme into the small-scale renewable energy scheme would be very problematic, because you're giving it to people who already have solar, already saving on their energy bills, and then people without it are contributing more to it, right? So we've got to be smart about how we deliver these subsidies in a way that's more equitable. But it's a serious question. And I think when you've got people living in homes, in rental properties that have mould, that have massive gaps in floors and ceilings, no insulation, is it a battery that they want? No, it's gap sealing, it's insulation, it's getting off of gas, so changing out your inefficient electric appliances where gas in the home is causing asthma and those sorts of things. And then, I think batteries is probably a little bit down the track. If the government announced a solar battery package for social housing, First Nations housing, would I say no? I wouldn't say no. But I think we need to be smarter about how we do things.
Sandra, do you want to?
Yeah, on a policy front, I'm with you, and I think the questions you raise are really good. But I think one thing that's interesting is to reflect on is, well, we're all familiar with the massive cost reductions that we've seen in solar over the last 20 years or so. In large-scale storage, we're seeing a similar phenomenon. 5 years ago, it was about $1,200 for a kilowatt hour of battery storage. I'm talking to a developer who's installing something for about $400 now, fully installed. So prices have dropped by about a third. That's to about a third of what they were just 5 years ago. That's at the large scale. At the small scale, a Tesla Powerwall costs about the same now as it did 5 years ago. We're not seeing those price reductions coming in the household area. So the economics are really tough to make happen without assistance. It's very hard to justify now. But if we saw the costs of small scale follow the same curve that large scale have, then I think the economics would shift quite dramatically. It's a great frustration. With large scale solar, an interesting thing there. Small scale solar actually is fairly competitive in Australia with large scale solar. We're so good at putting solar on rooftops. We're so efficient at doing it. There's obviously no costs for land acquisition. There's much lower development costs. There's no loss of energy in the transmission and distribution. So the cost differential, that you would expect that the lack of economy of scale would make rooftop solar a lot more expensive, and it does in many other countries. That's quite marginal in Australia. When we get that similar thing happening in storage, if we do, then these questions are going to be a lot easier to answer.
Thanks for that. Dana, do you want to come in?
Well, I was only going to back in some of the comments that were made earlier there as well, which is, and to do a shameless plug for Victoria, because you said you were from WA, so I've just got to lean in on it. We're reviewing right now our minimum rental standards, and as Kelly said, that's for renters. That's where the money's at. It's about insulation, not about the batteries out the back at this point, and that makes the difference in a cost of living crisis where quality of life matters. And we take it at Trades Hall, we look at it from the viewpoint of how can you go to work and how can you get a job if you can't heat your house, you know, if you get asthma from the air that you're breathing in your own house. I deal a lot out in Geelong as well too. I spend a lot of time in Gippsland and Geelong, and the quality of housing in some parts of our community is just totally unacceptable. And not just in far regional rural parts of the world, like Geelong's 50 minutes from Melbourne. Like, this is ridiculous. So I think the money really has to be around the more than just the batteries and more than just the solar. It's about the energy efficiency standards, and it has to be minimum rental standards. And Trades Hall's been shamelessly saying, like, we have a right to shelter. There's a New York model of a right to shelter. And should there be a ticket process here? You can't rent your property if it's shit. You just can't. Like, let's just have some minimum standards. I can't believe we let this shit on the market. So, like, I want renters who are workers to be living in good homes so they can go to work, so they're healthy enough each day to go to work. So we see it from a human rights but also a workers' rights perspective.
Here, here.
I wasn't quick enough in the beeping. But I also want to plug Climate Works have done some amazing modelling around renovations pathways that sort of talks about, even from a emissions perspective, efficiency, electrification is a really important way to get there. Yeah.
Another question up here.
Yeah, really interesting point about the no fires. I hadn't even gone there. But I had a question about end of life. Begin with the, not people, batteries. Begin with the end in mind. Do we have a gap in the skills and capacity for dealing with battery in particular, end of life, but panels, etc., on the circular economy piece here in Australia?
The biggest gap we've got is how young the fleet is. The average solar panel in Australia is only 4 years old, right? And many of them are now warranted for 30 to 40 years. So there's actually the waste stream is so low right now, but there are some big developments there. Victoria, I think, is leading on. It's illegal to landfill any e-waste at all. And solar panels and batteries are considered e-waste. And Queensland has just started a stewardship program for making sure that there's an end-of-life process for solar panels, inverters, and batteries. So those schemes are starting up. I'd like to see New South Wales coming on board. It hasn't yet, but really it's not yet a problem, but I've got a lot of confidence that the public appetite for allowing e-waste to go into landfill is very, very low. I think governments are going to get on board long before it's a significant problem.
Yeah, great.
I was just going to say I'm forever the optimist. And yes, there's knowledge and skill gaps in a bunch of different sectors. I also work in the offshore wind heavily. Gippsland will hopefully have the first offshore wind. None of that scares me. We have an exceptional TAFE system. We have exceptional training and accreditation. We just need to map what needs to be done, and then we'll be able to skill the workforce to do it. And the only thing I'd say that's really critically important, which is again me bringing a bit of the class analysis into this as well too, is that it needs to be skills not tied specifically to a company or to the equipment of that company. It needs to be skills that are transferable.
Thanks, Dan. Sorry. Thanks, everyone. Great talk. My name's Corina Lester. I'm a Yankunytjatjara woman from the Arnongo Yankunytjatjara lands in South Australia, so right up in the northwest corner of SA. And we heard from Malinowska saying SA is doing great in renewables, but remote communities do not have one solar panel on our roof in our communities. We don't have anything large scale, but our land that we have, which is hundreds of thousands of square kilometres of land with no solar. So what's the issue in this situation in order for me to understand, to go back to Arnongo and say to Arnongo, this is the issue. One, we don't have panels on top of our roofs. Two, land but no panels, maybe one supply that will supply our, what we call Umawa, which is like an administration space, maybe reaches to another community 60 k's up the road. So for me to understand what are those issues? Is it expense of solar panels? Is it isolation? Is it because we're too far out and we're in the centre of Australia? We're a long, long way away from, businesses that have solar panels. What are the issues in order for Arnonga to understand, but also for Arnonga to play a role as well on how do we set up ourself a reliable power supply for our own communities in our area of South Australia?
I'm really disappointed to hear that South Australia is such a leader. The International Energy Association recently recognised that the two most interesting areas in the world for decarbonising electricity grid is Denmark and South Australia. So to hear that there are pockets of South Australia that are being left behind in the transition is really disappointing. We've had some chatter about Western Australia, where I'm originally from. Horizon Power there is doing amazing work with regional communities, with First Nations communities, and it's not just doing the right thing, but it's also economic. In a lot of the communities, trucking in the diesel is incredibly expensive, and solar became competitive with diesel about 15 years ago. Solar and batteries are more competitive, very competitive with diesel now. So you could be getting rid of almost all the diesel in those communities. It'd be great if South Australia could take a leaf out of WA's book, if there could be some pressure applied to South Australia saying this is just not good enough, because it's absolutely technically feasible. You can take people and go and visit the communities in WA and see how it's done.
And can I just add, Karina, probably the thing you didn't say that you and I were talking about earlier, and that probably a lot of people in this room don't realise, is that in most remote communities in South Australia, Northern Territory, some parts of Queensland, First Nations, and it's only First Nations, housing are on prepaid meters. So what does that mean? We get electricity bill, we pay it, when it's due. First Nations communities have a card that they have to purchase a card and put in a meter. Once that card runs out, they're disconnected. So First Nations communities lose their energy at least once a week. In many communities, it's 2 to 3 times a week. In summer, when it's 45 degrees in the outback, it increases to 3 to 4 times a week. So people lose their electricity. This is their fridge. They have medications stored in those fridges. There's no way to stay cool. It's really problematic. And working with the communities in Tennant Creek, we know that when they were able to put solar on, it went against the Northern Territory government. Uncle Frank put solar on his home, had to use a bolt cutter to be able to connect it to the house. He's never been disconnected since, because solar is providing the energy for his home. So we know that solar, in combination with improving the energy efficiency of homes for First Nations communities, is a real solution to some of these problems and energy bills. And it's a really important question that you're asking, why is this not happening in remote communities when it can do things like generate employment for First Nations communities, improve cost of living, improve health outcomes. Like, we're closing the gap on so many indicators, and energy and home is a critical source of that.
Great.
Yeah.
I was just going to say really, really quickly, I don't know, because we've given the wrap up there. I just want to say I'd love to join you in the struggle for this. And there's public sector workers, there's comrades from the government that are here, and we should talk to them, because it's true. Overwhelmingly, it's going to middle class people for solar panels and the rest of us, because that was the easy path and the easy route. So let's make sure that it's workers, the working class, regional and rural areas that don't get left behind, and we have to do the heavy lifting to make sure that our bills are affordable as well too.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think Trudy tells me we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds or less. We know that both major parties right now, and a number of the independents, are really talking about this as a vital next step in our energy system. What are you hoping to see out of the government in the next 6 months? What would register as success for you? Maybe we can start with Reverend Mata.
Thank you. I think I just want to reiterate what I began by saying, is that transitioning to renewable, clean, affordable energy has to be accessible for everybody. Auntie has raised a really important issue about making sure that our First Nations people, this is basic human need, that we don't leave anybody behind as we transition to this new phase. Is exciting. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to continue to remind the government of the everyday people that may get left behind as we transition, and we will not let that happen. As our commitment as a uniting church, uniting climate, to stand alongside that. That's it.
What an honour to be on this panel. Obviously, workers' rights are going to be central to any kind of climate efficiency package, so I'll always plug that. But just to say that it's just goes without saying how important it is that our First Nations brothers and sisters, our Pacific Island brothers and sisters, we all get a better transition from this.
There's murmurings that both the government and the opposition are putting together packages for home electrification, for batteries, solar, smart appliances. So it's fantastic that we might be on track to have a race to the top rather than race to the bottom that we often see in elections. I remember years ago talking to Solar Citizens, a people-led campaign, and I asked them to describe in their simplest terms what Solar Citizen is about, and they said we want to make solar panels a right, not a privilege. Right? We want to make it a right, not a privilege. And I think we're getting there in the Australian political economy, where I think most Australians would think it's just not right that there aren't solar panels in what I'm sure is an incredibly sunny part of the country, and we're trucking in diesel that probably came from the Middle East. So. Yeah, let's keep working to make solar a right, not a privilege in Australia.
Rattling it off. All right, so we got 300 million 2 budgets ago for social housing upgrades, 15% of social housing. We want the government to fully fund social housing upgrades and prioritising First Nations. That's about 1.2 billion, am I now? Yep, thank you, I can't add. That we want to see there. We want to see the federal government work with the states and territories to implement mandatory energy efficiency standards. So we want the feds to put dollars on the table, as I talked about, for incentives and subsidies so that states and territories will implement mandatory standards, and we want targeted program for low-income homeowners as well. We haven't talked about, but we need things like one-stop shops, because finance is one barrier, but the other barrier is people go, who do I go to? What do I do? How do I improve my house? So investing in one-stop shops is another really critical issue. And then the trades as well. We need apprentices. We need the jobs, or else we're just not going to do this at all. And it's safe. Yeah, absolutely.
Beauty. Thanks, all of you. And then to end, I just wanted to, this has been a very Australia-focused panel, so I wanted to zoom us out again to the geopolitical scale. And it's not a secret to anybody that this COP is actually happening in a really, frankly, frightening moment for democracy around the world. We are seeing a huge wave of right populist movements that are toppling left and center-left governments. And they're doing it by driving a wedge on issues like climate, where climate is for the rich. Climate is for the folks in suits who work in cities, but I got to pay my bills. And so a package like what we're talking about here is really a democracy defense package at the end of the day. if we are going to have climate action be successful and not lead to the sorts of tragedies that we've seen in my home country, the United States, we need to move urgently to make sure that actually it's the lowest end of the economic scale that feels like climate action and the transition is for me. It's benefiting me now, and that's how you make these things resilient, and that's how we make our democracies resilient. So this starts with a solar panel on your roof. It zooms all the way out to the state of democracy in the world, is what I want to argue. And we appreciate you talking with us on this today. Please come up, ask questions afterwards. We'll be hanging around. Thanks, comrades.